much for coming to this 2012 edition of the Weil Lecture on American Citizenship. My name is Jon McGowan, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities. The Institute has hosted the Weil Lecture on American Citizenship since 2000, but the Weil Lecture has been held at UNC since 1915. The Weil family has been in North Carolina since 1860 and have been great benefactors of this university and of the state in general since that time. We are honored tonight to have several members of the Weil family in the audience with us, and I'd like you to join me in a round of applause for them. Before I forget, please reach into all your pockets and find those noise-making devices and turn them off. You can turn them back on about an hour and 15 minutes from now. I want to say a quick word about the format that we will follow this evening. Our guest, Governor Jon Huntsman, will be joined for a public conversation with Hodding Carter. And they will have a conversation of 20 to 25 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. We have microphones at the front of the auditorium. Please come forward to ask your questions. And we will try, this is like being on an airplane. Don't make too much of a line at the front of the airplane by the restroom. So let's try not to have 17 people lined up to get to the microphone, but please wait until the line goes down a little bit before you come forward. I want to say a little bit something about Hodding Carter, who I know is familiar to many of you, but it's always a great occasion to list the wonderful things that he's done in a long career as a public servant and as a journalist. Hodding is currently a distinguished professor of public policy here at Carolina, and prior to that, he was a journalist and a government spokesman of note. He served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs during the Jimmy Carter administration, and then served as the president of the Knight Foundation from 1998 to 2005 before coming to Carolina. In between his time with the Carter administration and at the Knight Foundation, he was a journalist, particularly a broadcast journalist, and worked for all of the major outlets, including ABC, CBS, PBS, and the BBC. He is the winner of 4 Emmy Awards and also the Edward R. Murrow Award for broadcast journalism. As for our guest speaker, Governor Jon Huntsman, who we are delighted to have here tonight to talk with us, my colleague from the Religious Studies Department, Lori Maffley-Kipp, will do the introduction of Governor Huntsman.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Lori Maffley-Kipp. I serve as the Associate Director for the Faculty Fellows Program at the Institute for Arts and Humanities, and I'm also the Chair of the Department of Religious Studies here at UNC. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker and guest for this evening, Jon M. Huntsman. We at Carolina pride ourselves on our commitment to serving the public good and to thinking broadly and linking our research and teaching with the future needs of local communities, the state of North Carolina, our nation, and our increasingly globalized society. I cannot think of anyone more appropriate to deliver the Weil Lecture on American Citizenship at this particular moment than Governor Huntsman. The Weil family supports this lecture series as a way to broaden discussions about citizenship and community involvement. And there is no doubt that Governor Huntsman is an exemplary citizen, community leader, and a man deeply devoted to public service at multiple levels. His life's work is a rich and varied testament to such commitments and to the value of working across partisan divides for the greater good of our nation. As a 2-term governor of Utah, he garnered awards for his management and became a leader among governors as chair of the Western Governors Association, as well as a member of the executive committee of the National Governors Association. In an era of increasing partisanship in national politics, 4 presidents from different parties have tapped Governor Huntsman for his exceptional diplomatic skills and specialized knowledge of Asia. He has served as the U.S. Ambassador to Singapore, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Asia, U.S. Trade Ambassador, and most recently, U.S. Ambassador to China. This last role prompted him to call for increased attention to the U.S. relationship with China in coming years, and he has continued to encourage a deeper appreciation of the importance of this relationship into the 21st century. Governor Huntsman also ran as a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination during the last primary season, as some of you may know. In that role, he presented a refreshingly thoughtful and candid voice, filled with needed humor and self-deprecation, a voice that cut through many of the platitudes of campaigning with a coherent, constructive, and principled vision of common purpose in both foreign and domestic contexts. That commitment to broader collective values is also reflected in Governor Huntsman's civic engagements and service to many organizations. He serves on numerous corporate boards, has garnered 7 honorary doctorate degrees, and he is a distinguished fellow at the Brookings Institute and a trustee of the Reagan Foundation. He is also the chairman of the Huntsman Cancer Foundation. Let me add on a personal note that my first introduction to that outstanding research center and hospital came during a tour of the University of Utah in Salt Lake City several years ago, when a colleague escorted me up a long, winding hill overlooking the Salt Lake Valley to the end of a road. There, I encountered perhaps the most beautiful hospital I have ever seen in my life, a center devoted not only to state-of-the-art treatment of thousands of cancer patients per year, but to the Phase 1 clinical research necessary to eradicate this family of diseases. For all of these reasons, Governor Huntsman's life work fits well with the commitments of the University of North Carolina to political engagement and public service, as well as the traditions of philanthropy and community involvement demonstrated by the Weil family. Our format this evening, as Jon has mentioned, will include a discussion with Hodding Carter, UNC Professor of Leadership and Public Policy and former State Department spokesman for President Jimmy Carter. As we ponder our next steps at a critical moment for our university's work on behalf of our state, our nation, and our world, we look forward to hearing Governor Huntsman's views and engaging him in conversation on the topic of America 2012 and beyond, challenges and opportunities. Will you please join me in offering a very warm welcome to Jon M. Huntsman.
Thank you. Thank you. To be clear, this is going to be a discussion at the governor's request, though I assure you that most of the burden of the discussion will fall on the governor, who has some things of substance to say on a number of subjects. Because we are just coming out of an election season in which his hopes and the hopes of many who looked to his candidacy were not fulfilled, I want to begin with a question which is, on the gauge of things, narrow, but nonetheless may have something to say about the future. You used 2 words as you left the scene. One was corrosive and the other was toxic about the state of politics in the United States today.
I was trying to be charitable.
He was being charitable. That being the case, is corrosive and toxic a phrase which is inevitable in the future? And if it's not, what will change it?
Hodding, it's a pleasure to be with you, as it is this terrific North Carolina crowd. This is a fabulous campus. And for the students who are here, I just want to remind them that they have such a unique head start in life, what you're learning here, the people you're associating with, the relationships that you're building and developing. It's such an attribute to you and will serve you well in life. And I want you to leave these back doors when this evening is up, and I want you to all kind of pursue a renewed commitment to this great country of ours. And I was reminded when Lori was providing that very thoughtful introduction, what Lori forgot to say is that if I knew anything, Hodding, about the subject matter, I wouldn't be sitting here with you tonight, I'd be somewhere else. But she charitably bobbed and weaved around that one. But I'm reminded, Lori, that we were born roughly about the same time in Palo Alto, California. So my one grandfather was head of Palo Alto Hardware and later mayor of the city. He was a Republican, but he was first and foremost an American and a mayor of a great town. Can you imagine a Republican mayor of Palo Alto today? I can't either. My other grandfather worked right down the road, and this gets to the point that I'm trying to make, Hodding, in a place called Los Altos, where he was principal of Los Altos High School. Now, here's what I remember about my grandfather Huntsman, because he was a great reprobate and a truly unique personality. As you walked out of his home that he built himself after World War II, and I used to go visit from Los Angeles to mow his front lawn every now and again as a kid, he had a picture on the wall as you walk out the front door, a Republican, my grandfather Huntsman, a school teacher, of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. I'll never forget that, walking out of his front door. I'd always see the president and the vice president, even after Kennedy was out of office. Why is it that at one point in our recent history, we all felt good about putting our president, regardless of our political affiliation, regardless of our background, we were proud to put our president on the wall? That was my Republican grandfather, who was a school teacher. And I say we can learn a lot about our past as we move forward. And somehow, some way, we've got to remember that we are all on the same team, first and foremost. Before we're Republican, before we're Democrat, we're all Americans, and we forget that part of the conversation. So for the younger people who are here, yeah, they're going to have to take forward this spirit of rebuilding the United States first and foremost as Americans and less as partisans. But the race was an interesting experience, Hodding, and for those of you who haven't run for president before, it's an intimidating and sometimes daunting journey. My wife, who's a Floridian, gave me some advice as we started. She said, let me just be very straight with you. We've been married 28 years. She said, if you pander and if you sign any of those damn pledges, I will leave you. And I figured at that point in time that life was going to become pretty difficult as we journeyed through those early primary states. But it only got worse when a guy named Michael Moore went on television and said, that Huntsman guy, he seems pretty reasonable. And I knew we were toast in Iowa. And then Bill Clinton, your old friend, got on television not long thereafter and said, that Huntsman guy, he seems pretty unhidebound. I think he's a Republican I could actually vote for. South Carolina in the thing. So people say, how'd you get off to such a feeble start? And I say, boy, if only you could have walked in my shoes in those early months. But it was a journey that did remind me. So here's where we came from. Governor of a great state, the most open, transparent job in the world. In our state capital, in Utah, you can wear guns in the Capitol. I mean, people walk right in the office, with guns on. Meet with the governor, you don't need a magnetometer or anything, it's just wide open. You go from that environment to probably the most compartmented job in the U.S. government, that of being the United States ambassador to China. where you're behind barriers and walls. You work with some of the great professionals in the second largest embassy in the world. You speak a kind of a different language, literally and figuratively. And you pursue a different set of interests for the United States in the world of diplomacy. Then from that on to the highly circus-like stage of running for president, where you're supposed to use a completely different lexicon and think in different terms and kind of be out there and all over the place. And I was reminded through it all, particularly in watching this nation from 10,000 miles away, which stimulated our interest to begin with, that we sometimes forget that this nation, despite our challenges and difficulties, we're sometimes our own worst enemy. We're sometimes hypercritical of who we are and the journey that our nation is taking. And when you see it from 10,000 miles away in Beijing, you're reminded of this light that shines, these values of our people. And I don't say that in any way other than completely respectful of our nation's tradition. I don't care whether you're Republican, Democrat, libertarian, vegetarian, whatever. We have a name brand in the world, and you begin to understand that when you live overseas and certainly try to slug it out in the world of diplomacy. We're known for liberty, democracy, human rights, free markets. And I don't care how you want to slice it, which end of the political spectrum you come from, that's where it comes down. And you see the light shine in ways that really does move people, inspires human rights dissidents to the point of tears, and still changes history in the world. And you can't help but come from that experience 10,000 miles away, jump into a presidential campaign and enjoy every single day of it, even when people are yelling and screaming at you. The blogs are filled with all kinds of negativity and people want to shout you down. You say, this is who we are. It's part of the American journey and experience, and all that's great. But in the end, let's remember that we still have to make the system function. We still have to make it work. And that's always been done by people of goodwill and good common sense, who somehow meet in the middle from differing perspectives and grind out compromise to where the American people benefit. And that's the part that we've lost sight of. When compromise is seen as analogous to treason. Now, I compromise every day of my life. I can't deal with my 5 daughters without compromising on a regular basis. I can't stay married for 29 years without compromising. We had to compromise all the time in the business world to make things happen. And in politics, how on earth do you expect to get anything done unless you sit down with people on the other side of the aisle, you join hands, and you put something out on the table that can be synthesized and massaged into some sort of compromise that's good for the American people?
I would say that purged the system of toxicity and corrosive. That was a good start toward the hard job. Listening to you, I was reminded of the memorable times in American history in my own time, which names arise as those who reached across the aisle to make something important happen. Arthur Vandenberg, a one-time isolationist who makes the Marshall Plan possible. There is great old Everett Dirksen, somewhat seduced by Lyndon Johnson, voting for the Civil Rights Act in 1964. I use those names because they came out of the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Who do I turn to today, my good American and Republican, and say they will be the Vandenberg, they will be those who will reach across the aisle? Because you're right. How do we make this place work unless you make the compromise work?
The system today doesn't incentivize results. And as I said on a morning show very, very early this morning, Morning Joe, somehow, some way, we have to figure out in our political system how to incentivize and reward results. I mean, people who actually come together with good ideas and throw those ideas before a legislative body and achieve results. That's the way the system works. Today, you're incentivized to go to the extreme ends of your party. You get on TV, you get to go to fundraisers, you get to send out all the screaming emails to your constituents. And with a system that incentivizes polarization, and you can't expect people to move to the center. And people say, well, we don't like centrists. I say, I don't care what you think about centrists. Don't call them centrists. Call them pragmatists. Call them doers. Call them people who want results. That's what the system lacks today. So the Evan Bayes of the world, the Olympia Snows, the folks who in earlier years would take the handoff from right and left and synthesize legislation into something that was doable, they've been blown out of the system. They've left because there's nothing more to do, not even a budget after 3 cycles. And there's no machinery in the middle of our legislature to actually take those ideas from the respective corners of politics and synthesize it into public policy.
Again, I think about, while listening to you talk, the people that once tempted me to go far across the aisle and to do more than simply talk about the need for coming together, but coming together. Remember my father, who voted as many times for a Republican for president as he ever voted for a Democrat, which I found offensive, but he found to be absolutely necessary in a nation like this. But I also think about the state I grew up in and the region I grew up in which compromise was considered betrayal of the essence. And we have a lot of politics in this country today in which compromise is considered betrayal of the essence. How did we get here? You said incentivize change. Where do we reach into the levers and get out of here?
You want my honest take on that?
Yeah, I want your... Yes.
I'll never get elected dog catcher after this one. I think money in politics has become toxic. You want to get back to the toxic comment. Super PACs and the big money, they incentivize bad behavior in politics. I've been on both sides of this debate. I've been for a wide open system. I've debated a more closed system. And all I can tell you, having knocked on endless doors, raising money to run for office, the system is broken. You could get people of average intelligence in a room together and say, come up with a scheme whereby we can finance our campaigns. And there's no way that they would come up with what we have today. It's an abomination. And it's an embarrassment to 315 million people who deserve better in this country.
And yet I look out here and I think about that, with which I agree, and I bet you if I were to run a poll right now, there may be 5 people out there who would disagree with you. But the 5 people who might disagree with you might be the only ones anybody listens to in Raleigh or in Washington when it comes time to write the check. Can you legislate this out of existence?
I think you can lead a national conversation on issues of fundamental reform. So to my own mind, having been out and done a clinical trial of sorts politically, where's the next big thing? I mean, what lies around the bend for this country politically? Let's face it, we've been hit hard twice, and I don't think we've fully recovered. We had 9/11. It changed our foreign policy, our interaction with the rest of the world, the way in which we look at ourselves, and have developed the Department of Homeland Security and impinging upon personal freedoms and liberty, I think way too much. And then we were hit by an economic storm that devastated every single family somehow, some way in this country. We've been hit hard twice. And we're still trying to, I think, make sense out of our recent history. We need some points on the board, to put it another way, as a nation.
I think to my students who are out there, I hope you listen to that, because 2 traumas in a row.
It's 2 traumas in a row. So we finished out the Cold War, having won it in the late 80s. Arguably, we squandered a decade, not knowing what to do with our newfound prestige on the world stage. Wasted. And then we were hit 9/11. And I don't think this nation has been the same since. But what lies around the bend, Hodding? Listen, let's face it, our economy is going to improve. We're going to see unemployment drop. We're going to see GDP rise. Maybe in the next 4 to 5 years, we're going to do better. Our manufacturing base is going to recover in ways that I don't think we're even thinking clearly about these days. So I serve on the board of Ford Motor Company and Caterpillar Corporation, which makes a lot of big yellow tractors around the world. You know, who would have thought that Caterpillar would have moved a tractor facility from Asia back here to the United States? Or that Ford Motor Company is investing billions in manufacturing here in the United States? There's something happening that is going to leave us better and stronger, and we're not focused on it because we're still hurting from the economic storm. But as the economy improves, I think the next discussion for this country is going to be, how do you reform a system that is broken? How do you lead a national conversation that addresses not the fiscal deficit, because we'll kind of be addressing that and dealing with it, I think, short-term and long-term, beginning next week. But the conversation will then turn to, how do you fix a trust deficit, which is still very real in this country? It isn't the fiscal deficit. It's a different kind of deficit, but it's equally corrosive, if you know what I mean. And it gets right to the heart and soul of having lost trust in our institutions of power, having no longer any faith in our elected officials. This is hard to talk about. It's really hard to have a political conversation about the trust deficit because the answers are so difficult to kind of define and promulgate. Because the answers are about campaign finance reform, let's face it. I think some of the answers are about term limits. And I've been on both sides of this discussion as well. All I can tell you is there's something called incumbency that grows very deep roots. And pretty soon people don't want to leave office. And it adds to our trust deficit. Pretty soon you become part of a system, and we wonder why crony capitalism prevails in Washington. We need to freshen up the system and infuse it with new energy and new thinking from time to time, and it's just not happening. Why is it that we're paying members of Congress who can't balance a budget? I mean, why is it that we would do things that any small business would never be caught dead doing? They're just small issues that get right to the heart and soul of trusting your government again. Because we have to get back to a level of trust. We have to get back to a level of encouraging and inspiring people to get in the mix, to run for office, local and federal, to get involved in a system that today most people are saying, thank you, no. I'd rather watch the circus play out and watch on television. So, you know, here's what I found. I mentioned this to a group earlier today. You know, you stand on that debate stage, and I did, I don't know, 12 or 13 of those. I called them game shows because they weren't informative debates. They were, you know, questions about your tax reform program, your take on nuclearization in Iran, and by the way, you've got 15 seconds to give us an answer. So everybody had these canned sound bites that they bring to the debate, and it wasn't a debate. It was sort of a popping off of canned sound bites. And I'd look at the debate stage, and I'd say, in a country of 315 million people, I think the brightest, most creative, innovative people on earth, this is the best we can do? I mean, I put myself in the same category. The barriers to entry into presidential politics are pretty damn low. Everybody should recognize that point.
Again, out there, Governor, there are a few friends of mine who came, as I did, from another line of work called journalism, and thinking about barriers to public life. Talk to me a little bit about how you see the role that media play today, both in encouraging and discouraging good people from running, encouraging the most yapping dog who ever yapped to yap louder, because that's the way you get noticed. You want to say something nice about the media?
Well, my grandfather Huntsman, Lori, who I described earlier, who was principal of Los Altos High, he wanted his sons to be teachers because there was no higher calling in life. And he said, but not everybody's cut out to be an educator. You're always going to need a fallback position in life. You can always go into business, which my dad did, and he did pretty well in business. But I got the same lecture growing up, and it was, you know, son, if you want to change this world and move people through good humanitarian, you got to go into business. But not everybody's cut out for that. You're always going to need a fallback position in life. You can always go into politics. And my daughter, who I recently had the same conversation with, I said, Abby, you've got to go into public service. That's how you can change the world, transform lives. But not everybody's cut out for it. You're always going to need a fallback position. You can always be a journalist at the end of the day. And now Abby works for the Huffington Post in New York. So I have to be careful about what I say. But I sometimes yearn for a single strong voice that sets it straight in America. You remember in the earlier generation, Walter Cronkite?
Sure.
Whether the moon landing, Watergate, the Kennedy assassinations, it was always the reassuring, whether it was jubilation or whether it was despair. There was always a reassuring voice that the nation rallied around and trusted. I don't know who's a journalist and who isn't in today's political market.
Newt Gingrich.
Because you show up at a political event,
right,
and here's the reality: a town hall meeting, everybody's got a camera, everybody's taping, everybody's trying to get a Q&A session with you, and in some cases they're members of your competitor's campaign, and they want to trip you up, and they want to get a little sound bite and a little part of video that they can turn into one of those crappy ads they put on TV, and so you say, all right, where are the journalists? I see some at the back of the room, but everybody else has a camera, and they're all trying to film some angle. They've all got some interest in it. We need responsible journalism. We need rigorous journalism. We need the kind of investigative and political journalism that seeks truth and the facts instead of frivolity. One of the big challenges, I think, in politics today is what constitutes fact? Everyone has their own sense of reality. It's something that you can't help but pick up on when you do 1,000 town hall meetings across this country. And people will stand up with questions, whether healthcare or Afghanistan, and everybody has their own set of facts. And everybody today can park themselves in a different alleyway of life and feed from an information source that seems to reinforce their own bias. We're all guilty of that. And they reinforce their own bias, and they walk away saying, I thought that was right. I knew that was the case. And they take those reinforced biases to the town hall meetings without maybe broadening the horizon, without speaking to others, not of their political persuasion, to get a different perspective or a different take. That's what good journalism is. Good journalism makes you think, and it penetrates the issue beyond just the dramatic and the superfluous, which we have far too much of.
I would love for you to keep talking, particularly to a large section of this audience along these lines, but what we didn't talk enough about, my being the one candidate nobody ever saw, we didn't talk enough about in this presidential campaign was our real role in the world, as opposed to did you or did you not know what was going on in Benghazi or whatever. But what are we to do? How are we to proceed? What is America in this post-war world, Cold War world that you described, in this war on terror world, a wonderful phrase, the war on terror? How are we to proceed? Are we to be eternally the hegemon who is going to be the one to which everyone turns? Are we to continue to be the person who sends in the troops? The moment I thought of truth on this subject in a period you described was when the first George Bush spoke of the New World Order that was to be constructed out of cooperation between nations. You remember that phraseology from George? Whatever happened to that?
It fell victim to the New World Order. that thing that came out of the Cold War, the post-Cold War, where we didn't quite know what to do with all of our gains. And consequently, we lost the gains. And then we were hit tragically. And I think we've been trying to put together the pieces ever since. But I think what lies ahead for the United States in terms of our global engagement is a sense of whether or not the people of this country are prepared to engage competitively in what's going to be a highly competitive 21st century. So we're bogged down in the Middle East. We need to clean it up. We need to put the pieces back together again. We need to use a little more diplomacy and a little less militancy. We should have been out of Afghanistan a long time ago. We achieved our objectives, and it's time. And listen, yeah, I was criticized some during the campaign, saying, "Well, you know, you're just an isolationist." I said, "No, I'm not. I've lived overseas 4 times, for heaven's sake. People have, you know, called me a globalist much of my career, but you know, where America's interests are at stake, let's be very realistic about how we proceed, timeline, cost, exit strategy. We're just not abiding by those simple principles. At least we haven't recently. But the big thing for this country won't be Afghanistan, and it won't be Iraq, and it won't be Benghazi. You know, it will be whether or not we are prepared for the competitive challenges of the 21st century, and that will be about economics, and that will be about education. And it will play out across the Pacific Ocean, where 2/3 of our trade will flow, where the rising militaries are, and all I can say is we're behind in the game. I've heard endless discussion about Benghazi, and you know, so I'll speak tomorrow morning to the regional security officers gathering at the State Department, a place you know well, who are all responsible in their individual areas for things like the Benghazi. Yet once this week, I haven't heard a single discussion about the most important transition that's happening in the world, apart from our own election, China. You've got the rise of the 5th generation of leaders, and the decisions they make over the next 10 years based upon who gets put into power this week will impact every single member of the next generation. Economically, from a security standpoint, culturally, we haven't even had that discussion in this country. I don't know why. Maybe it's too complex of a subject matter or not sexy enough, so to speak. But we're missing a huge opportunity in this country to have a conversation about where America's real 21st century interests lie and what we're doing to prepare for those.
What should we, the phrase is, right now I'm going to sort of go away from phraseology and go to specifics. What do we have to do about education, for instance? I mean, I think everybody from right to left says we have to improve education. I say thank you. I got 12 grandchildren. I hope we improve education. What does that mean?
It means that our kids are literate and numerate. In today's world, you have to be both. As governor, I infused Mandarin language into our public schools. It's my second language, and I thought, you know, around the bend, these kids are going to see that as a huge asset. And we took out German and French a bit, and I got some nasty letters from some French teachers, and I said, no offense needed, recognized from my part, but let me just say, when you look at 21st century strategic languages, for the United States, French and German probably aren't going to be among them. We've got to be realistic about what we're teaching our kids and the skills we want to give them as they step out on the world stage. And beyond that, I think with my own kids, I've come to find, so I'll have the 7th birthday of my daughter Asha tomorrow. She's adopted from India. She was tossed out the day of her birth and put in a Catholic orphanage, and now I'm lucky enough to be her dad. And another daughter, Gracie, who's from China, similar circumstances, she's 13. And how's this? You know, Dad loses his election. Gracie just won her class election in school. And, and I say, only in America would you find something like this. Yeah, my daughter from China comes and says, Dad, you lost, I won. I say, you gotta love this country. This is a remarkable place. But what did we come to find in raising our own kids and what I tried to apply as governor? There is such a thing as early cognitive development. And I'm no expert in the field, and you'll have to read Piaget much to grasp it. But if we don't capture our kids by age 6 in terms of literacy and reading, I think we've hobbled them later in their career. where you find real costs that begin to emerge when you have to get kids brought up to speed. So investment early on in education, which is what we tried to do in our state, and I think to some success, hitting certain milestones by 6 in reading and math, I think is critically important. It's not always about more money, it's about priorities. And I think most of the experts in the field will probably tell you that if you can't hit a certain level of literacy and numeracy by age 6, you're probably going to pay for it later in life. And I think we fundamentally, say what you will about education, Paul, there are a lot of great ideas. This is probably the most powerful that we ever discovered in our own state, that we put money behind, that we prioritized around, and I think it's important.
On the other end, an area of some real sensitivity in places like Chapel Hill, a public university. What about the other end of education, at the undergraduate level and graduate level? What priority do we give that in this new world of ours?
One of the things you see from 10,000 miles away is that the United States still is the world leader in education, higher education. Our colleges, our universities are the envy of the world. Outside of the embassy and the consulates we had throughout China, of which there were 5, the endless lines of young kids who all wanted to come here to school. And China's now #1 in terms of students in this country, having recently overtaken India, maybe 150, 160,000 here in the United States, which is impressive. But I think we're going to have to seriously evaluate our array of opportunities that we're offering our young people in this country. Not everybody can afford a 4-year institution. Not everybody needs a 4-year institution. I would argue that as we recreate a manufacturing base in this country, which I think is going to be very real in the years ahead, we need more vocational training. We need more hands-on skill development that this country has lost over the years for whatever reason. We have to recreate that model, whether it's enhanced community colleges, which are more affordable, whether it's vocational skill training centers, which we don't have enough of in this country, that can partner, as we tried to do in our state, with the private sector. They can help develop a curricula and help to fund them, so these kids are trained and they walk out the front door immediately employable. These are the kinds of things that I think, from a higher education standpoint, we're going to need to focus more and more on. There's hardly anything of a public institution left in higher education. They're all becoming private because of the funding models, and that's a shame.
I'm not sure exactly. Yes, I just finally got the and I recognize we have to go to you all. You understand we are totally blind up here, but I have to ask a question nonetheless because you're a guy who can answer it. What are we to say China is? We have had boogeymen all my life. We had the Axis powers, we had the communists, we have terrorism. Is China our next great boogeyman, or what is it?
We are so interlocked economically and increasingly culturally. We're the first and second largest economies on Earth. Our trading relationship is almost $500 billion strong, soon to be the largest ever known in human history. We're married and divorce isn't an option. You got to figure out how to make the relationship work. And that's what our political class doesn't understand. You just can't wish it away. It is so interlocked at so many different levels, and moreover, we don't have just a bilateral relationship left anymore. It's a global relationship. It's the only global relationship of its kind in the world, the United States and China, because there isn't an issue that plays out anywhere in the corner of the world that isn't impacted by the United States and China somehow, some way. We need to recognize that reality and begin to develop a 21st century relationship, knowing full well that, as my predecessor, Winston Lord, used to say, it's a sweet and sour relationship. You know, like it or not, the U.S.-China is a sweet and sour relationship, and it probably always will be. And you have to build around those realities. You're going to misfire and disagree on some issues, and there might not be a solution. And in another category, we've got to do a much better job in terms of capturing our shared and our mutual interests, and we haven't done that very well.
Now, for those of you, we're not over. We're not over. Good answer. Come forward, children. Not in large numbers, and do me a big favor, identify yourself, particularly if you're going to throw a bomb, okay? I'm going to start on my left. Yes, sir. I think it's yes, sir. I'm going to start on my right.
Yes, sir. I'm Michael. I'm a junior here at Chapel Hill. I apologize in advance because my questions can be a little bit blunt. But Governor, your name has been mentioned in several political blogs this morning, Political Wire, Daily Caller, Daily Kos, about potential openings in President Obama's cabinet, particularly Treasury Secretary and Secretary of State. My question is, if you were offered the opportunity, would you serve in those positions, or are you more focused on potentially running a 2016 campaign?
I have the feeling the administration is just needling me. So I have to answer these kinds of questions. I call it, as I responded to a New York Times reporter tonight, it sounds like a whole lot of idle hallway gossip to me, and we'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, sir.
But
thanks anyway.
May I tell you, that's as good a way to evade an answer as I've ever heard in a lifetime as a spokesman.
May I say that I watched one of the best State Department spokesmen in recent history for that kind of advice?
Yes. Governor, I happened to catch you on Morning Joe, and I congratulate you for getting a word in edgewise.
That is tough.
I understand that. And towards the end, you talked about how there is going to be a leader of the Republican Party in the coming 4 years. Who would you think might emerge, if not you, and would you support them?
Well, you're kind of suggest that I would be anywhere part of that mix because I'm so often disinvited to recent events. But the great thing about the political marketplace, and let's face it, it's a free marketplace in politics, is you never know what's going to happen. You never know who's going to emerge. You don't know who's going to win and lose. Look at right up until election night. I mean, everyone was on the edge of their seats wondering how this election was going to go. And then we wake up to a world that half the country didn't think was possible and the other half, are jubilant about. But the Republican Party will ebb and flow based on ideas that come out of kind of the heartland, based on solutions to our problems of the day. And it's hard to predict who will be part of that mix because I think the marketplace is so wide open these days that voices will emerge that nobody ever thought possible. And maybe voices that were considered dissident at an earlier time, putting forward new ideas and new approaches. That's how open the market is, I think, on the Republican side right now. And as I mentioned to a group earlier today, we would be wise as a party to draw from our very rich and successful history. We have a long literature of personalities and leaders and successes that go right back to Abraham Lincoln and include Theodore Roosevelt and Eisenhower and Reagan. And we forget, some people think the Republican Party was just created in 2000. We've actually got a history that everybody forgets about, that we can actually draw some inspiration from. And I hope that as we go forward and refine a party, which is critically important in having a two-party system, that's great for a democracy, that we begin to reach more into our past.
Years ago, I was on a panel with James Dickey, the poet from another Carolina in Tulane. Somebody asked, who will the Democratic ticket be in 1972? Dickey was, as usual, drunk as a skunk. He stood up, he grabbed my arm, and he said, we're here, we're here. I was waiting for you, Governor. You're next.
Hello, I'm Brian. I'm a first year here, and I just want to say it's a privilege to have you here tonight. And my question is, what policy initiatives would you recommend that the U.S. take unilaterally, bilaterally, and multilaterally in addressing the trade imbalances resulting from our relationship with China, particularly in regards to their currency manipulation?
They're only. I want to congratulate you on that one.
Would you like the answer in Chinese or English?
Both. Without getting too much into the weeds, let me just say that our best economic policy toward China is getting our own house in order here in the United States. Because we can't deal at a macro level on currencies until we address our imbalances right here at home. And we can't compete on the world stage unless we get back on our feet with a sense of confidence behind this economy. And China, for its own economic growth, is going to have to address reform around the state-owned enterprises. And that's going to happen, if it does, sometime next year or the year after, with the rise of Xi Jinping, who will be the new leader after next week has passed. And he will lead the fifth generation forward. And in his mind, I am confident, is an understanding that in order to get the balance right with the United States economically, from a global, a regional, and a bilateral standpoint, he's going to have to tame the state-owned enterprises, which in China for too long have written their own rule book, and markets have not opened as planned under the agreement with the World Trade Organization, and they're going to have to continue appreciating their currency, which is woefully undervalued. All of that will be an important part of what China must do, and there's also stuff that we have to do here, and I've already gone over that in getting our own house in order. It's the most important economic relationship this world has ever seen. And I had a journalist from Chinese television in a couple of days ago and said, well, you know, terrible things are happening. America's criticizing China on telecommunications business, and we've got a new WTO case on auto parts. And I said, listen, this is a $500 billion relationship. What do you expect? I mean, we still have Airbus cases with Europe that are highly sensitive. We have softwood lumber with Canada, some of our greatest friends in the world. With an increase in volume will come trade problems. That's to be expected, and nobody should be surprised by that. We're going to read about them all the time. The question will be, can we in good faith and with a sense of confidence and purpose and resolve sit down at the negotiating table on both sides and find solutions? Of course we can if we put our minds to it and if we have a sense of trust that underlies it all. But right now it's not there. And we've got a couple of years now to build that up. Yes.
Yeah, hi. I'm Ian, a recent transplant from Brooklyn. And Governor, it was refreshing to watch you run in the primaries as a sane man with integrity in a field that was...
Yeah, thank you.
Dominated by people like Herman Cain and Michelle
You saw how far that got me, right?
But my question to you is, do you think the fact that you weren't cartoonish enough for what's now been dubbed the media entertainment complex is part of what led to the demise of your campaign? You mentioned the toxicity of the super PACs. Do you think that the soundbite news is also a major problem in American politics today?
Well, you hit on, and thank you for the question, you hit on a very important point, and one that we could spend all evening on. And it did occur to me during the campaign that maybe we should just do something really goofy to get in the press and to get talked about so we could gain a little bit of traction. I kept coming out with these policy statements. We thought, you win an election based on good ideas and solutions. Foreign policy, energy, education, so, you know, tax reform, so on and so forth. And we'd roll it out there, and the headline would be not the content of what we had talked about, but whether or not I had said something about one of my opponents. You know, Huntsman says about Michelle Bachmann, you know, the following, that I might have said going out the door from the policy speech. And I say, what do we have to do to get people to actually absorb and write about the ideas that so desperately need to be addressed, as opposed to the tit-for-tat, back and forth drama of politics? And it's a very real point. I don't know what you do other than getting back to what we said earlier. Responsible journalism must prevail. Well, this year we're going to solve it. All the political reporters are going to go up to Harvard, to the Kennedy School, and they're going to beat their chests and pull their hair and agree that they did badly. And it'll be the 20th time in the last 4-year cycles that they've done this. And when they're through having repented of their sins, the next cycle, they're going to do it again. Believe me, I'm not exaggerating. This is what we do. We repent and then we sin. Yeah. Which side was on last time?
He's next.
You need to go over there? You're it.
Governor Huntsman, Andrew Bauer. There's a lot of economic uncertainty in this country right now, despite the fact that things are improving. There's consumer confidence is increasing, but there's a lack of investment among venture capitalists, and there's a lot of uncertainty and apprehension among entrepreneurs in this country. What would you attribute that to, and as a leader, how would you address that to improve our economic progress in this country?
The market hates uncertainty, and today we're still in an uncertain environment. So the work that happens beginning this week through January 20th is going to be absolutely critical in projecting a market of confidence and certainty to the marketplace. Once that is done, and I think this country is about to have a moment of clarity. I really do, in the weeks ahead, and that is Republicans and Democrats finally coming together saying we can't do this anymore. We have a fiscal cliff. And if you look at the economic implications of what that carries, nobody wants to deal with it. And behind it, creeping up that nobody's paying attention to, is a downgrade by Standard & Poor's. Now, you remember the Moody's downgrade from last year. I remember being on the debate stage when we got the downgrade. It said, it roiled the markets and created all kinds of response by the political class. First time in the history of our nation we've ever been downgraded. Well, there's an S&P downgrade that's lurking right around the corner unless we can get our act together before the beginning of the year, which I think is going to focus people's attention. And that means that we're likely to have some broad parameters around tax reform, around deficit and spending policies, and what our 5 to 10 year horizon looks like. I think that's going to be done, and I think that's a good thing for this country. And I think the marketplace is going to respond very favorably because the marketplace is searching for certainty and predictability. And if we can get there by early January, I think the marketplace is going to respond.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir, my name is Andrew Perrin. I'm a sociology professor here. And I apologize if this comes across as a partisan question. It's not intended as such. But you had some terrific words about compromise and civility in Washington, which I think all of us value tremendously and can see from even 10,000 miles away is desperately needed. Michael Mann and Norman Ornstein and their liberal and conservative took a recent look at Washington, I think intending to make a case like that, threw up their hands and said, it's really the Republicans who are intransigent and not, in fact, willing to compromise. You've come out also in favor of, just now, in saying that civil liberties curtailment in the wake of 9/11 was a mistake, that campaign finance needs reform. So I suppose the central question for you is, why do you remain a Republican?
Because I believe in the values espoused by Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt and General Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan. I'm for a limited government that's right-sized, that can deliver adequate services that the taxpayers expect, and I'm for a bold, confident foreign policy that isn't isolationist but projects boldly and powerfully our values as a country. And I think that we are the most hopeful and optimistic people on earth, and many derive value from the role that we play. Maybe not recently. I think we've found ourselves in a quagmire or two, which is unfortunate. And that set us back. We just had to be very frank about where we've been and learn the lessons from where we have been. But that takes me to the Republican category. I'd have to say that economically, I'm a strong Republican with a libertarian bent when it comes to social issues, which I hope is where the party ends up going. I don't think it has a choice.
Why not a third party?
What's that?
Why not a third party?
Well, here's what I think happens in 2 or 3 election cycles because the trends are inexorable. You've got the fastest growing party in America, which is the unaffiliated party, Just look at a college campus, any college campus in America, unaffiliated, even in the red state of Utah. Unaffiliated is what people are becoming more and more. If you extrapolate that reality out and figure that it will intersect head-on with the disruptive technology of the internet, which is going to change the very dynamic of how we deliver and see politics, you're going to see something emerge at some point. But the barriers to entry are high. The Electoral College is a real impediment, and the party establishments, which raise money mostly, are a huge impediment as well to a third party. That's not to say it's not going to happen. I think it's inevitable over time.
I can't possibly see you. Are you holding up one finger? Are you? Two more questions. All right, where was I on the last question? Are you next? No, you're next. All right.
Recently, I heard Simpson Bowles speak on this campus and address the deficit, the increasing deficit. I believe they said at the present rate of spending by 2020, it will cost $1 trillion a year just to service the debt. It seems to me that it's it may be difficult for somebody to be elected if they have the platform of fiscal responsibility. What is your comment about addressing the deficit
I think one of the greatest injustices that is being left behind for this next generation is debt. Because after a while, you can't see it as just debt when you're $16 trillion. When your debt to equity, when your debt to GDP ratio is 100%, you can't compete in that kind of environment. And it's a tremendous injustice what we're doing to the next generation because we're saddling them with a lifetime, a career of deleveraging, which is what everybody's doing now. Every family, every business, big and small, every community, every state and the federal, everyone's deleveraging. We'll get to a point where our balance sheets will begin to improve, and that'll be a good moment for everybody. But longer term, this debt problem is very real, and at some point we have to see it as a national security problem because it affects our ability to compete. And I think we need to use different terminology when we talk about the debt. It is a national security problem. We need to tee it up as such. But in talking to Alan Simpson, who's a friend, and I think he's one of the great Western leaders we've produced in a long time, a great statesperson. But he would tell me that we have $1.1 trillion in loopholes and deductions built into the tax code that nobody watches after. Just every year they get put back in. And the drag that this is having on our tax code, coupled with our debt levels, both of them need to be addressed and need to be addressed immediately. But the 2020 issue, if we just sort of keep going as we are, debt repayment, Social Security, Medicare, and nothing left for discretionary spending. Defense is in there too. But what do you do about disaster relief? What do you do about any other discretionaries? There's nothing left. It's all taken by 2020 on our current trajectory. So this is an issue that carries a level of immediacy that the next generation should rally around and find as their generation's big issue.
Do you think the politicians will address it?
Pardon me?
Do you think the candidates will address this? It doesn't seem very popular.
Politicians will address it.
Yeah, the politicians.
This is a really difficult one because everyone's pointing blame at somebody. And we forget, we didn't get here due to one person or one party or one administration. It took a whole lot of people from both sides of the aisle and different administrations and different parties to get us all the way up to 16 trillion. And until such time as we meet in the middle and say we're all responsible for where we are. I don't care if the ramp up was more aggressive the last few years. Of course it was. Yeah, we had an economic emergency, but the rest of it came from somewhere too. And meeting at some point in the middle and developing some sort of compromise around spending restraint. Simpson Bowles does about $4 trillion plus over, I think, the next 10 years is what they're calling for, which I think is, a good place to start. Is the conversation that we need to have. And I'm a little concerned that the Simpson Bowles compromise hasn't been put in the center of our political discourse because we have an answer. It's staring us right in the face, and nobody wants to own it or embrace it at this point.
Sure. Last question, or I'll never be invited to do this again, and I need the free meals. So, yeah.
Good evening, Governor Huntsman.
Sorry.
My name is Jon M. I'm a freshman, planning on majoring in business and political science, so I hope your father's advice about having a fallback works as well for me as it did for you. My question's mostly centered around China. So given the fact that outgoing President Hu Jintao has essentially, in his outgoing speech to the National Congress, continued to extol the old maxims that you constantly hear from the Communist Party, such as the virtues of one-party rule, the power of state-owned enterprises and their importance. Do you have any sort of speculation on whether or not possible new members to the Standing Committee, whether they might be more open to kind of liberalizing markets and liberalizing the political system? And how feasible do you think that is, given the possible leadership transition that's taking place?
So just very quickly, we're starting now, next week, the 5th generation of leadership in China. We had Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping will be surrounded on the standing committee of the Politburo, which is effectively the board of directors, by about 6 others. They'll go from 9 to 7, a change from the 2002 16th Party Congress. And around him will be people like probably Yu Zhongsheng, Shanghai, maybe Wang Yang from Guangzhou, Wang Qishan, who has a very solid and pragmatic grasp of the world and international affairs. I think they know that reform must occur. You can't talk about it at the party Congress. You can't get up and say anything in this exalted atmosphere this week beyond a few references to reform. The work will begin after Xi Jinping consolidates his power, which may take 6 months, with the party, with the People's Liberation Army, and with the princeling population. I have no doubt that he knows what must be done on the reform side. It's a question of when and how aggressive he pursues it. But this generation, I think, when you stop to say what is in their interest is preservation of the party. The party is not preserved unless the economy works. Therefore, everything they do and all of their decisions must go right to the heart and soul of making the economy work, building up 6, 7, 8% GDP growth year over year. And that's what's going to be in their minds over the next little while, along with things like how do you deal with the internet in a closed society. You can't be an innovative, creative, entrepreneurial country, which is what China ultimately aspires to be, when you block the internet. I think they're going to have to come up with a better defined internet policy, which I think is going to happen too. So right around the corner, I think we're going to see some issues play out under Xi Jinping, who's fairly pragmatic, who's confident, who has DNA in his genes, if you look what his father did in earlier generations. And the question, I think, will then become, is the United States ready to engage with China, to help support, to nudge, to put forward what really needs to be a 21st century relationship? And I'll just end with this thought. The cycles of the U.S.-China relationship are very distinct. And most of the time, we have a very hard time getting together on common ground. We have elections, in which case it's a whole lot easier for a politician to say what they're going to do to China as opposed to with China. And in China, they don't have elections, but you got to believe that the party has similar conversations. And I've seen that when I've gone out to local universities in China. But we're entering a time here, re-elected president in the United States, 5th generation of leadership now coming to the forefront in China. We'll have 2 to 3 years of unencumbered run room. And it's a hugely important opening for this most important relationship of the 21st century to get it right. And I just hope that on our side, we've got some clear thinking about what our interests are and how we're going to approach China to make this relationship work, because we've got a whole bunch of people around the world who are going to be increasingly dependent on the long-term stability and goodwill that's built into this relationship.
Thank you.
Governor.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Governor.
Thank you.
I'm going to say it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That was terrific. That was terrific.
Thank you.
I ran a very small paper in a very small town, and the benefit was that you saw everybody running for office at one time or another coming through that town, and you got a fairly good idea about who they were. I only can say one thing. As a Democrat, thank God they didn't pick you among the Republicans.
You're a good man for saying that. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.